Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here today. I'm Giacomo Boati. I'm working for IHS Markit, which is now part of Standard & Poor's Global since a couple of months ago. More capabilities, larger teams, doing always the same thing, which is essentially, as far as I'm concerned, consulting in energy, which means a lot of due diligence, market planning, business planning for storage and downstream companies. So today I'm talking about the impact of energy transition in the storage industry, similar topics and overlapping in few areas compared to what the previous presentations were. The presentation is divided into 3-4 parts. So the first part is about policy. And obviously it's really the stone of the whole discussion because energy transition is expensive. We just had Mark mentioning how more expensive HVO is compared to diesel. All of the new clean fuels are extremely expensive, and you have to make big infrastructure investments to have them on board. So, which means that policy has to be the one that pushes towards that target. So we're going to look at the current regulation and policies and see how they are planning to go towards energy transition. And then we're going to focus quickly on the conventional liquids outlook to see what the future is going to be like for the typical fuels, road transportation fuels, the fuels that we're actually typically storing today. And then we're going to focus more in detail on the clean fuels to make some conclusions for what is to be expected. So the policy context. So first of all, what we're talking about when we're talking about policies to go into energy transition. Obviously, it's all about initially global warming and how to cope with that. So reducing GHG emissions is a key element in here. Obviously, nowadays we realize that also security of supply is the same side of the story. So it's only reinforcing the story. Reducing GHG emission is the main target of the European policies. As we are in Europe, we're focusing on European policies today. So reducing GHG targets, emissions, the target is by 2030, reducing it by 55%, and then going towards a net zero emission towards 2050. What does that mean if we're looking at how this chart is showing all the different sectors and the emissions since 1990 to 2019, right before the COVID crisis? Well, if you look at that chart, essentially what you see is that all the sectors have been reducing actually for one reason or another, more efficiency, decrease in growth in some areas, but have been decreasing their carbon footprint, so to say, with one exception, which is transportation. So extremely difficult to decarbonize the transportation sector, which has increased by a third the footprint in the last 30 years. So the key goal of reducing GHG emissions in Europe is really focusing on transportation and impacting that sector. So which are the policies now? So we have in this chart, in this slide is divided into 3 parts. The first part is the key elements, the key targets of the Renewables Energy Directive, which is the one that has been already adopted in Europe in 2018. In the middle part of the screen, you have a Fit for 55 package, which is how Europe wants to amend, how the European Commission is proposing to amend the Renewable Energy Directive with new targets for 2030. And then in the third part, you have a graph that is showing if you had to plot the targets in clean fuels, particularly on a chart, how they would be looking like. So the first point that I would like to make is that the Renewable Energy Directive from 2018 already is extremely ambitious and was extremely ambitious. So 14% renewables in transportation is a large number, requires significant investments, requires changing the way we operate, the way we use mobility in Europe and all the infrastructure around it. When we're looking at Fit for 55, which is what is being proposed and what is currently being discussed, it's way more ambitious already than RED 2. The targets are essentially almost doubling in a number of ways and forms. First of all, the 14% of renewables in transportation is expected to almost have to double. The actual target is 13% of GHG intensity reduction, which means if you translate it into percentages of renewables in transportation, an almost double target. But then more than that, there is the element that the Fit for 55 package is actually detailing the targets for some of the subsectors of the clean fuels, which is even more interesting and important. So you would have to have a minimum of 2.6% of renewable fuels of non-biological origin, which means, for instance, hydrogen produced via low carbon power. So it could be green power, such as renewables, could be CCS power, carbon capture storage, created power, or so on. So this target is already extremely challenging, and we'll see that in a while and why. Besides that, specific targets on sustainable aviation fuels, for instance, something that was not already included into the existing legislation. So this is something completely new under discussion, significant strain on the aviation industry and opportunity, but also challenging for the other industries to produce these fuels. And also, finally, also the bunker fuel. The bunker industry will be part of this story now. So those were two industries, the aviation and the bunkering part, were completely left out from the discussion until now. And now it's really, the discussion includes also these industries and the fuels to decarbonize them. So just very quickly, this is something that, again, wasn't included in the previous legislation, but you need to have about 5% of sustainable aviation fuels by 2030 in Europe, growing very rapidly in the next decades to 63% by 2050. And in the maritime, you need to decrease your GHG intensity. So again, something that was not included so far. And then the final point on policy that I would like to make, because there is a lot of discussion about hydrogen, which is, of course, an extremely interesting and important fuel, but what is actually saying the regulation, what are the actual plans? There are specific plans in specific countries. For instance, the UK has a very ambitious and big plan for hydrogen. Lots of European countries don't really actually have a plan, and one of the reasons is that, again, until very recently, the directive in Europe didn't quite put a specific target on hydrogen. You can see here, the new targets that are being discussed for hydrogen are extremely ambitious. Again, 50% of all the hydrogen consumed in the industry should be refillable, so so produced from green sources by 2030. And in addition, the renewable fuels of non-biological origin in the transportation sector that also is coupled with hydrogen. So hydrogen, all of a sudden, from being a very interesting fuel but with no specific targets, will be becoming very shortly a fuel that actually has to be part of the equation because policies are telling you so. So let's now quickly look at the conventional liquids outlook, and you probably expect, you've seen some of these presentations already in the past, but just to recap, one thing is important. So when we're looking at conventional liquid fuels, a large part of the story is road transportation fuels, and the main driver for demand in road transportation fuels obviously is a vehicle fleet. So here we're showing two graphs, which are essentially the evolution of a light-duty vehicle fleet in Europe from now to 2050. This is a scenario that we call the inflection that we developed in our company that is essentially relatively aligned with the RED II scenario. So not a Fit for 55, not the most ambitious one that is currently under discussion, but the one that is still the one that is currently being implemented in legislation in Europe. So as you can see from the left part, first of all, you see that it's divided into three parts: the conventional engines, so gasoline and diesel, and then the other part. So first of all, obviously, you see that, even though now it's true, we're going back to a sound demand for oil products, but the reality is that going forward, gasoline and diesel cars are expected to decline drastically, and to decline to leave room for all the other cars that are visible in this part of the slide, which are essentially battery electric vehicles and hybrids. So hybrids, again, reducing dramatically the requirements for diesel and for gasoline demand notably, and battery vehicles to obviously reduce completely the demand for these fuels. Battery vehicles are expected to reach about 35% in this scenario by 2050. But I think one interesting thing to look at as well is how rapid this is expected to happen. Essentially, it's growing very rapidly, but from a very low base, which means that essentially for the first few years, including the next 5, 8, 10 years, the impact is going to be relatively marginal, and then all of a sudden the impact is going to be very, very strong. Which is leading us to the future of conventional fuels, and here we're showing in Europe, showing three charts in this slide. First of all, the overall European demand as we projected in our inflection case scenario. So you notice that, first of all, demand has peaked. No surprise, we all know. It's phasing out gradually, actually relatively rapidly over the next 30 years or so. I think if the one element that you see from this chart is really the decrease in the diesel demand in the next 20, 30 years, that is expected to happen relatively rapidly. There is also a decrease in gasoline demand that goes with it, but actually not all the fuels are expected to decline. Part of the jet fuel story is positive. There are very sound drivers for demand in jet fuel. There are little alternatives for jet for now in the very short term. So we have few years of very positive growth for jet. But also there are fuels that are actually also feedstocks for other industries. And if you see here, one of the industries that is expected to be stable is the chemical industry. And so everything that goes into the chemical industry is most likely going to be stable for the next 20, 30 years. At least that's a forecast we're having now. And therefore, the feedstocks that are being used by the chemical industry as well, such as naphtha particularly, and also LPG in Europe, are one exception where we're expecting not to have a deep decline, such as the road fuels transportation. The last point I want to make on this slide, if you're looking at the graph in the middle that shows the total liquid demand by scenario, so we have two scenarios in our company. One is called inflections, the other one is called green rules. So inflection is very similar to RED 2, as I mentioned, and green rules is very similar to Fit for 55, which is what is currently being discussed. So inflections is declining, mildly, steep decline, but still manageable. The green rules is much stronger, the decline that you would have in refined product fuels, which means essentially a much steeper decline in particular in road transportation sectors. So this is also something that we should take into account, because potentially we are shifting to a Fit for 55 world. It's a discussion that is already on the table. So this is what it will be looking like. Now, obviously, the other part of the story is the clean fuels, right? So declining some fuels in conventional fuels are stable, some others are declining pretty steeply. Or what about the clean fuels? I'm taking a few examples here. I think broadly picture is very promising, right? Taking a few examples here, projecting to 2015, again, the same scenario, which is called inflection, so similar to RED 2, which is, again, already implemented in Europe. Here we have biodiesel FAME and then renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuels in Europe. We see that essentially, with the exception of biodiesel and FAME, that it's capped primarily for reason due to the crop related policies, or the fact that you can't really go too much on FAME because of European legislation. But besides, renewable SGO is growing a lot. And we know that there is a lot of different investments in this in this fuel. A lot of refineries are using it at co-processing various feedstocks in hydrotreaters to get to this fuel. Expected to grow, but actually there is a natural cap in the future for this fuel, which is due to the fact that diesel is actually being decarbonized and is actually decreasing out of the transportation sector. So you're gonna hit not quickly, but you're gonna hit a limit because of that reason. The other thing is that I think it's very interesting to look at the sustainable aviation fuel, where actually we see an extremely positive outlook, very strong growth, but coming from a very, very low base. So it's a fuel that it's starting to grow. It's not a fuel, it's various fuels that are starting to grow, but the growth it's taking on, it's going to be growing marginally for the first few years and then taking momentum. Eventually we'll be having significant volumes as well. So the volumes is another aspect of the story, because if you recall the picture that was shown here, the total demand in Europe is currently about 600 million tons per year, and then you compare with the clean fuels. Obviously this is not the totality, so it's just some of them, but it gives you an idea of the different in magnitude. So here we're talking about probably 50 million tons in the next 7-8 years. Completely different magnitude, which will require time to grow. So that's one other element of the story. And then I think one other aspect to be considered is the location of the production. I think has been mentioned today already, but essentially looking at this graph that is showing the HVO and jet production capacity projects in Europe for the next 10 years until 2030, and it shows all the projects that are being announced. So there might be some that are not coming on stream, but what you see is that it's divided into two parts. One is gray and one is light green, and the gray part is where projects are located into a refinery, so it's co-processing, or as a refinery that is converting to a biorefinery. It's anyway in that location, the same hub. The second ones are out of the refineries, and you see that they're growing over time. So we'll have more and more projects that are located in areas that were not, where we didn't see production until now. While refineries have always been the quote-unquote monopoly, so to say, of the fuels production for the last century, now we're going to a model where the geographical location is going to be more and more diverse, which means, of course, additional infrastructure, which means additional requirements for storage, and so on. So it's not going to be the same exact story in terms of the fuels and the locations that we've seen so far. And then one point on REFIMBOs. So again, this acronym, Renewable Fuels of Non-Biological Origin, which means essentially they have to come from a power that is a low-carbon power. So low-carbon power would mean essentially renewable, or carbon capture and storage, or nuclear if it's been accepted by the European Commission, which is completely unclear for now. So let's stick to the green part. If you had to be green hydrogen that is in producing the REFIMBOs, the target is extremely ambitious. So you can see in the first part the requirement as for the Fit for 55, which are 6-9 million tons of green hydrogen, which translates, second part in the middle, in 80 to 120 gigawatts of installed electrolyzers in Europe, knowing that we are currently, all the projects announced are currently about 20 gigawatts. So a huge increase in these projects by 2030, which means essentially we have 8 years to do all that. And not only these projects have to be new, but they have to come with new power that is created on purpose. So new renewable production that is coming on purpose for that means that if you're looking at the production of renewable power in Europe in 2021, which is about 1,000 terawatt hours, it's divided in this way. Onshore wind, significant part, but onshore wind is extremely difficult to build anywhere in Europe, you know, having the permits to do it, a lot of NIMBYs, so on and so forth. So the new capacity is not coming certainly from onshore wind only. It's not coming from hydro, because hydro is, the resources are there, there's not plenty of new hydro resources, but it means that it has to come from offshore wind and solar PV primarily. So in 8 years, you need to build 400, say from 300 to 400 additional renewable electricity, so almost more than doubling essentially the existing offshore and solar PV. Again, very challenging, which means that essentially if we stick to this target, and the target could be at least this 2.6% of refimbos by 2030 in the current regulation that has been discussed, most likely we'll need to partially import these fuels, because we don't have enough infrastructure, we don't have enough capacity in Europe to have it in the next few years. So importing refimbos would, of course, be potentially a very good opportunity for the storage sector to store it, to favor the handling of the products in different hubs and locations. So conclusions, a couple of points. So we touched on the conventional outlook first, and the picture is mixed, right? So we have a number of products that are meant to decline, and relatively steeply, road transportation primarily. We have few other products such as naphtha, LPG, and the chemicals product that are expected to be stable. And so depending on where you are in the value chain, you could actually be experiencing a relatively stable future in this sector, even in the conventional sector, conventional liquid fuel sector. But then when we move into clean fuels, there is obviously a tremendous amount of opportunities, but it's coming from a very low scale, so it's going to be difficult to have to convert all the storage and all the infrastructure to clean fuels, because in the middle there will be relatively little requirements for clean fuels. Secondly, the geographical elements. So it's going to be much more dispersed compared to the key few hubs that we had in storage in conventional fuels. So this is an element that is going to play in the future, new investments in new areas. And then finally, some of the clean fuels that are actually more interesting. Definitely a mention for sustainable aviation fuels that have been mentioned already today. Sustainable aviation fuels driven by the growth in the aviation industry is expected to be one of the key ones, also in terms of magnitude, particularly interesting. And the refined products of non-biological origin, the hydrogen, that will be also extremely interesting. And potentially the bridge not to the medium term, but to a very long term. Once we start having all the infrastructure to produce them in place, they will be really getting a significant scale and magnitude. That was it for my presentation. Thanks a lot. Happy to take any questions later on or to meet you during the breaks. Thank you.